So draw your attention, Ruth chapter 2. Hopefully you've made your way there. Would you stand in honor of God's word? We're just going to look at the first 3 verses this morning. This is an incredible story, and Act 1 has closed down. And Act 1 was a rough scene. You had a woman who ended up being a widow, 2 children passing away, leaving 2 widows as well, coming back home with no hope, full of bitterness. But chapter 2, things begin to turn a different direction. It begins with this in verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now make note of that in verse 2. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain. After him whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." Verse 3. So she set out and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. You can be seated. All of us have found ourselves in a place where we're stuck. You know, maybe it was something that you chose to be in and you just can't get out. Others, it's a circumstance that you didn't choose and you're stuck in it and you can't get out. No matter how hard you try, no matter what you try to do, you can't get out. Now, all of us experience this on maybe somewhat of a regular basis living in the city that we do, is that you get stuck in traffic. You made the decision to go the route you did. You made the decision to get in the lane you did, and you're stuck. And when you're stuck in situations like that, sometimes there's nothing you can do to get out of it. You're just there. You're in that situation, you begin to think about, man, I should have gone this way, I should have gone that way. If I could just get over one lane, I could get out of this, and we're stuck. We find ourselves in those situations, and sometimes being stuck is a really difficult thing because it hurts. It's frustrating. And for some of us, the stuck is no end in sight. We don't know how we're getting out of this. We don't know what's going to come. We're just here, and we don't want to be here. Well, Ruth and Naomi were in a situation like that. They're stuck. In fact, Naomi, for a long time, she'd been stuck. It wasn't just a season or a couple of years. She's been stuck for over a decade. Her family faced famine and was hungry on a daily basis. 2 children that were hungry, and so they flee and they get off to the land of Moab, and everything goes even worse from that point. They get in the wrong lane, and when they get in that wrong lane, everything goes bad. She loses her husband, she loses her 2 sons, and now she's left with 2 daughter-in-laws and all alone by herself. She spends 10 years in stuck. 10 years unable to get out. And finally, at the end of those 10 years, she gives up and she returns to home. She's got her daughter-in-law with her. And she left a woman desperate for help, and she's come back a woman bitter. Ruth is in the same situation. Ruth has dedicated her life as a young woman who has the opportunity to remarry, has the opportunity to move on with life, has dedicated her life to Naomi, to help her, to stick with her, to serve her God, and to be part of her people. But she too is in a similar circumstance of being stuck. She's a widow. She's a single woman in a man's society. There's not a lot of opportunity for her. There's not a lot of things that she can do. She's in a very similar situation as Naomi. And so you have at the end of chapter 1, at the beginning of chapter 2, 2 women without help. 2 women have no place to live. Maybe there's some old friends that have gathered around them, but their way of life and their moving forward, all of that is up in question. How are Naomi and Ruth going to survive? What's going to happen? What are they going to do to make it? And we're introduced to a law that Ruth takes advantage of, that she finds hope and help in. In verse 2, we're told that Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain. After him whose sight I have found, I shall find favor." Now, it just seems in that circumstance that maybe what she's going to do is she's just going to turn over kind of to begging. She's going to go to a field and she's going to try to see if she can get some of the leftovers of that field. So it's the beginning of barley harvest we read in chapter 1. And so what it seems like is that Ruth is going to get out there and just kind of try to scrum up some food and do something. But what you may not be aware of is that Ruth is actually taking advantage of the grace of God shown through an Old Testament law that God established hundreds of years before this for people just like her. In the book of Leviticus, and one of the first places we see this gleaning law is in Leviticus 19, verse 9. And listen to what it says. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes from your vineyard. And so what God is saying in this is that, listen, when you harvest, when you reap the harvest from your field, or when you go to your grapevines and you do that, listen, don't pick up all the stuff that falls on the ground. Just go through one time, gather everything you have, and yes, you could go back through and you could kind of scrape it, clean it up, and get the extras, but God says don't do that. Leave the leftover grapes that you didn't get on the first harvest on the ground, and leave what you didn't get on the first pass. Don't go all the way to the edges. Don't scrape the bottom of the barrel clean. Don't lick the bowl, in a sense. Does that make sense to some of us here? Leave it there. Gather as much as you can. Cover it thoroughly, but leave some there. Why? Well, that's what he says at the end of verse 10. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. This law is reiterated in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19, when he says, when you reap the harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, the widow. That the Lord your God may bless you in all the works of your hands. This was a law that was established by God that we see now applied and practiced in the life of Ruth that day. God has a heart for those in need. God has a heart for those who are in vulnerable situations, who are in situations where they cannot help themselves. And he calls his people to have a heart as well. But he doesn't just call his people to have a heart. No, God puts practical steps to take to provide through the avenue of his people for those in need. This is the grace of God displayed through the hands and resources of people. Now, gleaning may not have seemed much better than begging, but what it was that God was providing a way. God was making a way for those that are dear to his heart, which is mentioned as the poor, those in need, the sojourner, the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. God is giving the rich an opportunity to display and share his grace through their generosity. And it's not just an opportunity, it's a command. Whether Naomi remembered that law on this day and taught it to Ruth, we don't really know. We don't know that if it was someone from the neighborhood or from the village that said, hey, just don't forget about our gleaning laws. Go out tomorrow. There's a couple fields that they've already gone through and they've harvested, and it'll be perfect. And we don't know whether they remembered this law, whether it was something that Naomi had taught Ruth and they had talked about on the way when they were maybe discussing, what are we going to do, what are we going to do, what are we going to do? And she said, the gleaning law. We don't know, but we do know this. It's very clear that whatever the case is, Ruth fell on the grace of God shown through God's people. She was dependent upon it. Two things we ought to get from this morning. And the first thing is this: don't be greedy. We are blessed. Every single one of us in this room are blessed. We may not be farmers, but like the farmers of Ruth's days, we have resources. We have things. God has provided for us. He has put food in our pantry. He has put money in our pockets. He has put resources in our bank accounts. And God calls his people like you and me to not be greedy with what he, by his grace, has provided for us. There is an expectation, an opportunity, and a command for our generosity to help those in need. And I would specifically say to how Scripture applies this to help those who are poor, to help those who find themselves in foreign situations such as sojourners and aliens, and to help those who find themselves in the situation of being a widow or an orphan, the fatherless. I mean, those are the clans, those are the groups, those are the categories that are specifically mentioned in Scripture, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. We have an expectation from the heart of God who has a desire to help and grace that he wants to give to them, and he's directed that grace through the resources of his people. Don't be greedy. Be generous. Now, how we navigate this secularly and as a culture and even politically is not my concern. That's not the application we're trying to take of this. But how we navigate generosity and caring for the poor and caring for orphans and widows and the sojourner, foreigner, alien is a matter of spiritual importance. It is absolutely something that God expects of us. Don't be greedy. This story would end right here had it not been for the generosity shown through the obedience of God's people for the likes of women like Ruth and Naomi. And what we have from here, God works through the hands of generosity of God's people. Don't be greedy. But the second takeaway we ought to have is this: don't be lazy. Verse 2, Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean." I mean, I don't know if this was the same day they got to Bethlehem or if it was the next morning when they got to Bethlehem. But whatever the case is, Naomi doesn't say anything, doesn't figure anything out just yet, but Ruth takes the initiative and takes the responsibility to take advantage of the grace of God that is provided through his people and to do something about it. This gleaning law required that people went and gathered, that they went and picked up. This wasn't just a handout. This wasn't just something that we just received generosity. No, it's not that point. Work was involved. Initiative needed to be taken. What Ruth does in this story is that she doesn't sit around and wait. She works. She takes responsibility. And she seeks the grace of God through the avenues that God has promised to see if he would provide. And furthermore, in doing that, she honors her elder, Naomi. She doesn't just take on her responsibility. She takes on the responsibility of this aging widow and cares for her. She's doing double work. It's not just for me, it's for us. I'm going to go glean the field. I'm going to go gather. Never done this before, but I'm going to go do this for us, Naomi. She doesn't sit around and say, "So Naomi, what are we going to do? This is your home. This is your land. These are your people. Now they're my people. What you got in mind? What you got planned?" And she also doesn't say, "You coming? I mean, you're not that old. I mean, we did walk all the way from Moab. I know you can do something. As Ruth receives grace and falls upon grace, we see her also giving grace. And what a sweet, sweet picture of how God's people ought to be. We receive grace, we fall on grace, and we too also ought to give grace. And so Ruth takes responsibility. She takes initiative. She displays faith in the grace that God has provided through these gleaning laws. Ruth doesn't know what will happen in months ahead. She can't answer those questions. I'm sure she's thinking about it. I'm sure she's wondering, man, what are we going to do when the harvest ends? And what are we going to do next year? And what are we going to do for Christmas? And what are we, am I ever going to get married again? Am I going to have children? God, what are you going to do about this whole situation? She doesn't have those answers. The only answer she has is the answer for today. And the answer for today is there's a field over there. And there's a law that I've provided for you. And so she demonstrates faith in the grace of God that's provided for her that day. She didn't know what God had months ahead. All she knew is what God had provided for her today and what God had given her to do today. She had faith in the today, faith in the now. And what we're going to see as this story unfolds, and something so important for us to see that I want to hone in on for you today is this. Her faith today allowed greater opportunities of faith and provision tomorrow. But she'd have never gotten to tomorrow had she not demonstrated the faith in the now and in the what God had given her and expected of her today. Reminds me of another guy that we read in Scripture. This is the story of Joseph. Joseph had a big dream, and Joseph had a big vision. Joseph had things that he knew God wanted to do through him, but then all that fell apart, and he got stuck. He got stuck in a bad place. He got stuck in a pit. His brothers sold him into slavery and told Dad he was slaughtered by a lion. It's a bad day right there. I mean, you're dead. Everyone thinks you're dead. Now you're in slavery. And he's sold to this person named Potiphar. And what we see in the story of Joseph is Joseph took that opportunity, took the grace that God, he wasn't dead. He had a life. He was breathing. And so Joseph faithfully served in the position that God had given him for that day. And through time, in that little bitty faithfulness to do what he was faithful with the little things that God had given him, Joseph works all the way up to the top, and he's Potiphar's right-hand man. He oversees an entire estate and all his employees until there's a lie told about him by Potiphar's wife. And then he's thrown into prison. That's also pretty bad. But then he's faithful in prison. He's going to be a good prisoner. He's going to be faithful with what God has given him. The grace, the fact that he's still alive, he's still breathing. He begins to interpret dreams, and he's just faithful in that whole situation. And the faithfulness in the little, faithfulness in what God gives him, faithfulness in today leads him to the place and point over time that he is second in command of the world at that moment. He's Pharaoh's right-hand man, the prime minister of Egypt, all because he was faithful in what God gave him today. He was faithful with the grace that God provided today. He was faithful and obedient with what God had put him before him today. Jesus describes this sort of activity this way. He who is faithful with a little will be faithful with much. I think one of the things that we can see and we can learn from a person like Ruth is you may not know your future. You may not know how on earth you're going to get out of stuck. You're going to get out of pit. You're going to get out of hunger and thirst and out of the situation you do not want to be in. You may not know that. But you know today. And God has provided grace today. Be faithful with his will for you today. And you will see more. So amazing, the people that say, oh God, I want to know your will. I want to know your will for my life. I want to know how you're going to use me. I want to be used by you. I want to make a difference. I want to make an impact. I want to be special and important. I want to be valuable to your kingdom. And they ask these big things of God, and we ask these big things of God. Oh, God, listen, I would love to be one of those people, God, that you provide so many resources, and from those resources, man, I can make an impact for the kingdom. Man, I can send missionaries across the world, and I can fund nonprofit organizations, and I can help a lot of people. Lord, I want to be faithful, and I want to do that. God, would you bless me with that? Would you give me the opportunity to do that? But God, I want to see a lot of people come to faith. God, we want to be a church that makes a massive difference again in the city of Charlotte. Yet, but we can't be faithful with the resources that God has given us now. And we can't share the gospel with our neighbor who we know. And we can't be obedient and trust God to help us through the sin that we're battling today. The truth of the matter is, we don't need to know God's big, grand will. He's got that handled. We just need to know today and be faithful with the grace and opportunity He's provided today. Like Ruth, to just put one foot of obedience and faith in front of the other, trusting Him for now. Lord, maybe this is not what I want. This is not the situation I dreamed of. This is not what I expected, but it's what you gave me, and you've given me grace in this, and so I'm going to be obedient and faithful with what you've given me today. That's what Ruth seeks. That's what Ruth does. She knows the grace of God before her, and she takes initiative and responsibility and is obedient with it. Show yourself faithful in the small things. But there's something specific she's looking for in the faithfulness in these small things. There's something she's after here, and we see that at the end of her statement in verse 2, a phrase that's said several times in this chapter, and we'll look at more at it in the weeks ahead, but she says this, I'm going to go to glean among the ears of grain after him whose sight, and then she says this, I shall find favor. She's looking for favor. To fast forward just a little bit in the story, and we won't look at the details of it today, we'll look at that more next week. In verse 10, she makes the statement, I have found favor. Or why have I found favor? And in verse 13, she says, I have found favor. The journey she was on together that day was a journey to seek favor. She finds that favor. She enjoys that favor. What is favor? She seeks favor. What is favor? The favor of God can be described as His divine kindness or an act of compassion on the part of God Himself toward needy and undeserved recipients like us. It is in the same category as mercy and grace, in that it's a divine gift. It's an opportunity, undeserved, that God provides by grace and mercy, fully on His own merit and work. And she's seeking that. What she's seeking is the grace of God in this. Lord, you've given me this, and Lord, I'm asking for you to work. I'm asking for you to move in a way that I don't deserve. She takes upon the attitude, and she shows us the attitude of a person who would seek favor from God or seek the grace and work of God. She knows who she is. There's no question about it. Ruth knows that she's a Moabite and she's in a foreign country. She's in Israel. She's not a citizen of Israel. She's married into it, but she still is got the bloodline of Moabites, and those are not friendly people There's some bad blood between Moabites and Israelites. She knows she's in a foreign place. She knows she's in a difficult situation, a destitute situation, being a widow. She also knows that she's in a society that is ruled by men. And she's a woman, which would have been seen in that day, a person who did not have the advantage, a person who was in a more vulnerable situation, and beyond that, she's poor. She knew that she needed grace. She knew that she needed to go beyond her circumstances and situations. She needed something that she was not capable of on her own. She knew she needed it. And her act of going was her step of faith to receive it. She didn't expect someone else to be responsible. She didn't pick out what she was doing. She just went out with a sense of desperation and dependency, trusting that God would provide and asking God to provide. I need favor. I need help. I need grace. I need you, Lord. She knew that she didn't deserve it. She was at the mercy of God and the mercy of God to provide through his promise and through his plan of his people. What we see in Ruth here is a humility, is a trust, is an obedience, is a dependency upon the hand of God. We see faith in her. Faith put into action by trusting God and seeking God for it. Reminds me of a story Jesus tells many, many years later. Jesus is ministering and healing people. He takes a break with his disciples, gets a little bit out of town with people to an area called Tyre and Sidon. And they're together. And this foreign woman comes to him in a very similar situation as Ruth. She's a Canaanite. And she too has a desperate problem. She has a demon-possessed daughter that she can't control and can't fix. And so she interrupts this little get-together, this little discipleship group with Jesus and his disciples. And she says, Lord, my daughter is severely demon-possessed. I need your help. And the disciples are like, ugh, send her away. Get rid of her. We need our time together, Jesus. We need to have our holy huddle. I don't have time for this. I mean, Jesus, can't you just tell her that God helps those that help themselves? But Jesus allows her to press in, though he remains silent. And in the conversation back and forth, once Jesus began to speak, this woman with this problem, who's approaching a foreign man, who is a woman, who's in a desperate situation, says to Jesus, Lord, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Please help me. What does Jesus say to her? Okay. Let me see your giving report. I'll tell you what. See your Sunday school and worship attendance. What church do you go to? How many verses of the Bible do you know? And don't cheat because I wrote it. Because I'll know if you're cheating. Man, let me just tell you that this is great, wonderful. Sorry about your sister, but God helps those who help themselves. Or tell you what, there's this program. No, he says, woman, great is your faith. The truth of the matter is that we are no different than Ruth, and we are no different than this Canaanite woman. Inwardly, we are all broke, poor, without any hope. Somehow, some way, our sinful nature has convinced us that we're entitled to the favor and blessings of God. that God owes us something, that God deserves, that we deserve to receive what God gives. And we've got this whole, I can name it, and I can demand it, and I proclaim it, and he's obligated to do it. Bull. Let me tell you something. God is not obligated to do anything for you. He is God, and you and I are not. And the truth of the matter is, God doesn't need to do anything else for us, because what he has already done for us is far greater than any other thing that could ever be done for us. He slaughtered his son to save us from sin and hell and death. We will spend eternity praising God for that. That's what the throne of God is about. And that's what we will spend millennia after millennia after millennia thanking God for. Not healing us and not fixing our problem and not giving us that job and not making us feel better and not giving us everything we wanted. That's not what we'll worship God forever and ever for. That's not what makes him so glory. Not the stuff that he can do for us, but what he's done for us through his son, the grace of God he's given us that we didn't deserve. And that we still don't deserve. I don't care how faithful you are and how wonderful you are and how much you've given and how much you've done. You still don't deserve a darn thing from God. But by his love and by his grace, he pours it out on his people as they fall dependent and trusting in him. Like Ruth. And what do we see take place? You almost miss it. She knows the grace of God. She takes initiative and responsibility. She seeks the favor of God. And in verse 3, God shows favor. Look really closely. So she set out and went, and she gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Now, if you've cheated and read ahead, you know that's where the story goes from here. That what happens in verse 3, everything pivots, and now it takes the direction. And that's what we're going to focus on as we look at the rest of the story together. But I want you to notice this. It's interesting that the narrator mentioned in verse 2 that there was this relative who was a really good man. He was an honorable man, it says, and his name was Boaz. He was a relative of Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband. So he just mentions that, gives us that information at the beginning. You're kind of wondering, well, okay, well, I got an uncle too, or I got a cousin too. I mean, that's great. And then we see this name coming back into play. And then this name Boaz becomes a new character in the story who takes center stage. But I love the way the narrator says it in verse 3. And she happened to come to the field belonging to Boaz. There's one person, one unique, honorable person mentioned in this story. And it happens that this young lady, Ruth, finds herself in his field. What it literally says in the Hebrew language, it says, her chance chanced. Which really is our way of saying, as luck would have it, it just so happened, it just kind of, whoops. I mean, we don't know anything about this field. We don't know where this was. This the first field outside of Bethlehem? Was this 5 miles down the road? I mean, whatever the case was, she just happened to find herself in this field of this person she doesn't know, but this person is really special, and there's something really special that happens. It's almost as the writer is saying this, and as luck would have it, or it just so happened. It's almost like he's saying it with a wink. sarcastically to actually tell us the opposite. That it didn't just so happen. That it wasn't just by chance. This woman sought favor. She was desperate before God. She took initiative to trust God. She just demonstrated faith and asked God for blessing and grace in this. And guess what? God provided it. God gave it to her. Because he guided her steps to the field of the man that she would one day marry. Sorry, spoiler alert on that. Listen, let me tell you something. Our God is so in control of the small, insignificant, ordinary, day-to-day, minute-by-minute, second-by-second things that nothing just so happens. Every tick of the clock is by the hand of God, and everything that comes our way is by the hand of God. Now, I know you're hungry, so I don't have time to tell you the ways that I've seen God do this in my life. I wouldn't be standing here today were it not that it just so happened. I wouldn't be standing at First Baptist Charlotte were it not, it just so happened. God's at work in your life. He has a plan. He has a way. Trust him. Seek him. And be faithful with the field he's put in front of you today. Glean it. Pick up the grain he's put in front of you today. Be faithful to trust him now. And he will be faithful to be who he is to your life. Could be that where you're at, you cannot see 5 months down the road. You cannot see 5 years down the road. You don't like where you're at. You don't love where you're at. This is difficult. This is tough. This is hard. But I can promise you this. God's given you today. He's given you now. And if you'll seek him, if you'll depend upon him, if you'll ask him, I promise you that today there's some grain on the ground. Just pick it up and trust him. Let's pray.